I am not going to talk about all the colonies, and for each colony I'm not going to go into deep history, but when something significant happens that I think is part of the larger trend of where America's heading, I try to bring it in. In this case, this is the development of Maryland, and the ID is the Toleration Act. So in the case of Maryland, it is given to a friend of the king, and I believe it would be Charles I, gave a piece of land, a weird shaped, it's like the one state looks really weird. I don't think they even bother putting it on anything as a, maybe they do. But he gives it to a friend of his named Lord Baltimore. Go figure. Baltimore, the city of Baltimore. It's named for, I believe, Charles I's wife, Mary. And here's the factor you want to know about Lord Baltimore. He's Catholic. He's one of the few Catholic aristocrats. And Charles I was probably a closet Catholic. Well, Lord Baltimore is ready to open up shop and start getting settlers. And he finds out that he's got no customers. People from England aren't wanting to move to Maryland. Do you want to guess from what you know so far why many English aren't wanting to move to Maryland? What their concern might be? Because it's pretty Chesapeake land. I mean, that would be a pretty good reason to go there. What are they worried about?
Religious intoleration.
Yeah, that they would have to
Be Catholic.
There you go. Because that's what they're used to in Europe, right? You are what your prince is. So the Toleration Act, he has to make a proclamation, Lord Baltimore does back in England, and I think he even takes out advertisements in newspapers saying, if you come to Maryland, we will offer you liberty of conscience, is the phrase at the time, for Catholics, English Protestants. I think he includes Jews. Don't think he includes Muslims. But Jews, Protestants, and Catholics are welcome. You won't have to conform to his religion. Once he does that, more people begin to come to Maryland. So I think you'll all know that eventually America has to tolerate each other's differences of views on matters of religion. But we've got, as I mentioned before, Christianity fractures into all these little sects, SCCTS, and that they tend to define themselves by what they disagree with, what they think that they've got right based on Scripture versus what another group has. Up in Boston, they were intolerant of different views. A woman named Anne Hutchison was kicked out of the community for holding theological positions that were contrary to what the church taught. But over the course of time, we do realize that we're going to have to tolerate these things about each other. And I think that this points us in that direction. We'll have more to come. All right, Pennsylvania, and your ID here is William Penn. It's kind of this mid-Atlantic states we talk about here. New England is up there, but well, actually New England's up here. But the mid-Atlantic states are Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. Among those, I want to talk about Pennsylvania. So William Penn is an aristocrat, an English aristocrat. There's a picture of him up there as a young man. Can y'all tell what he's wearing? He does have a scarf on, so kind of dressed up. Well, you know what? He's kind of wearing something unusual.
He's wearing armor.
He is wearing armor, very nice armor. Look how that folds down over his shoulders. So he comes from a long line of aristocrats who made their way in the world with their ability to fight. His father was a titled lord. Do y'all remember from that video lecture where it talked about the coming of the Civil War in England, when the king would go around and get forced loans from people and never plan to pay them back? Well, William Penn's father had done a forced loan to either James or Charles. I don't remember which one it was. If it's 1643, It's probably Charles. William's news. William Penn is a great disappointment to his father because William converts, becomes a Quaker, which your ID is also an ID here. It's called Society of Friends. One of about 50 different sects that developed in England. Evidently, there was just a huge number of different groups in England that broke off in different ways. The Society of Friends, and this is an early drawing of one of their meetings, they called each other friends. There's a Friends University in Wichita, Kansas, which was a Quaker school. We know them as Quakers, like Quaker Oats, that, the guy with the hat and stuff, kind of looks like him, right? So the Quakers are interesting than other Christian sects. They believed in a divine spark, as they talked about, like God has kind of planted inside of us, and that you can cultivate this presence of God in you. It was theologically at odds with other people's views. It sounds a little bit like transcendentalism of the 1830s with like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. But another thing is when they met in their meeting houses, they would wait until the Spirit moved among them, and any one of them would stand up and deliver a message from God. It wasn't in speaking in tongues, but it was just this they waited for the Spirit to move among them. It also allowed for women to speak in their services and seemed to have as much religious authority or as a man. That attracted women to this movement. They felt much more accepted there. The funny thing about them is they were annoying. They would go to other churches, and as people came out of other churches, they would try to convert them, and they would try to explain to them why they were wrong in their faith. I don't know if you've ever had somebody show up at your door and try to convince you that when you tell them you go to church, and you're like, yeah, but you're not going to go to heaven because you don't do it right. You don't have the right beliefs. This evidently was what the Quakers were like in England. And they got so annoying that they were banned. They could not have churches anymore. They had to meet secretly in people's homes. Another thing about them that makes them especially disappointing for Lord Penn, when his son comes into contact with a Quaker and is led into that faith, is that they're pacifists. They don't believe in violence. They don't believe in fighting. During the Civil War, there were evidently a bad batch of guns, and they called them Quaker guns because they wouldn't fire. But Quakers were known as being pacifists. Well, this is a bit of a problem for an aristocrat, right? He doesn't evidently need that armor anymore. Well, his father dies, and his father's owed a debt. The Quakers are annoying. The Quakers feel persecuted, or the Society of Friends. And William Penn has an idea. He goes to the king, and he says, "You may remember that you owe my father a debt." And I suppose the king probably flashed a little anger about that. He said, no worries. I don't want money. What does he want? He wants a grant of land in the New World. And he asks, why would you want this? He says, because the persecuted brethren of mine will go with me. And he's like, really? You're going to take all the Quakers with you? He's like, well, that's... So, it's not a lot of land at first. It doesn't have much of any access to the Atlantic because New Jersey's on the front side of it. But where this, I guess, the Delaware River, would that be the Delaware River that comes up into there? Kind of near Philadelphia. There is, it's not coastal. And if you think about it, there's not a lot of land here because there's almost mountains immediately. It's really a small piece of property. However, it does include if they ever get there, claims to the western side, I think over to what will become known as the Ohio River. So William Penn and Quakers leave London, kind of like the Puritans left England too. Where are they going? They're going to America to create the perfect Christian society. This is his plan for his city that he lays out. By the way, it becomes known as Pennsylvania. He doesn't name it for himself, but he names it to honor his father. And the name of his capital city? Philadelphia, which stands for? It's a Greekified word. Which is Philadelphia,
Love City.
City of brotherly love. There you go. Which speaks to what they're trying to create, right? It is to create in a brand new land a sense of, it's overtly Christian along the teachings that they want. So for those who say that a very important part of the early development of the colonies was the desire for to make what you would, it was very true. There were just lots of competing groups who had different ideas about what Christianity meant. Later on, I think they had pretty decent relations with the Native Americans because there aren't that many of them at first. But eventually their numbers swell and they will have fights with Native Americans. But what ends up happening is a whole bunch of Germans move into Pennsylvania during the 1700s. So many German speakers are in Pennsylvania, they become known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. Dutch being the English word for German speakers. Deutsch. Deutsch is the German word for Germany. So the Pennsylvania Dutch is what it comes out. Now they were more willing to fight when it came down to it. And there will be some internal conflict between those who are more of the Germanic types. Also, by the way, outside of Philadelphia, there's places like Germantown, there's a King of Prussia, there's all kinds of the German influence. In fact, those two letters you guys read were both about these German immigrants and the desire to have them. So that gets us the establishment of another colony. Now, the English Civil War, this is an important development in world history. It's a critical development in American history and English history. It's the moment when England begins to become more democratic as opposed to living under a monarchy. There has been growing in Europe an absolutist or absolutism. Have you heard of absolutism as a political philosophy held by some kings? Absolutism. You heard of this? It means we're going to have an absolute monarch who is in control of all things. They will make the law. They will have the legislative function. They'll make the law. They will carry out the law. And they will appoint judges who will listen to them and who will determine whether or not someone has broken the law. The most famous and complete system like this was Louis XIV in France. Absolutism is this idea that the people listen to the king, and the king forms a government, and the king runs everything through his ministers and his judges and his top officials. Do we like that kind of system? We don't like that kind of system. We like government to be reflective of the people, right? And that would be democracy as opposed to monarchy. Well, in this English Civil War, we've got the Stewart Dynasty, which I gave you guys last time, and that's going to be James I, who's come down from Scotland, and then his son Charles. Now, here's what I want to say about James when he comes down from Scotland. When he meets Parliament, he gives them a speech. In that speech, he talks about the divine right of kings. He says that kings are God's chosen lieutenants for the people of the earth. And that in his kingdom, might as well be God, right? Because he is God's representative. And they need to completely listen to them like they would give over authority to God if he were walking among them. That's how he wants his subjects to treat him. Now, there's been a long tradition in England, going back to about 1000, something called Parliament. They'd forced upon a king in the Magna Carta the right to consult with the king on certain laws. This document, the Magna Carta, had created the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Various different titled positions, like the Earl of this and the Baron of that and the Duke of this, would all be able to sit in the House of Lords. and they could come together, and they would have, before the king could do certain things, the only thing he could really do, he had to call them together if he wanted to go to war, and he had to call them together if he wanted to raise taxes, right? Because those are the two big things that people get most upset about. The House of Commons was made up of boroughs around the country, and people would send representatives there. But they weren't elected based on democracy, but based on townships and things like that. It's a very limited form of representative government. This parliament could only come together if the king called them, right? He would invoke parliament. He would call them together. He would present what he wanted them to do, and they would give him what he wanted. And then they would go home. If they ever started acting in a way that he did not like, he would dismiss parliament. And if they tried to come together separately and come up with some policies they wanted to force on the king, he would accuse them of treason. And that would be a very dangerous thing. So we have a very limited representative government here. James I only called Parliament once. It was because he got in a war with another country and he needed taxes. The government the people didn't want to pay it, and so he sent them home. This is his son Charles I who takes over. Both James and Charles have got a problem in their hand. They're involved in various wars. They're trying to grow their government, and they're short on money. I will say this about James and Charles. They would go through the documents in the castles looking for old laws and old maybe fees that used to be imposed on the people by former monarchs. And they would say, because this monarch 500 years ago authorized this, I'm going to authorize it too, and I don't have to call Parliament. And that irritated the English people, that he would revive these old laws and try to get around Parliament for raising taxes. Another thing the kings would do is that they would announce that they were coming to visit someone, a duke, and they would go and spend a lot of time with them, and they wouldn't leave with their men until the man gave them a loan. These were called forced loans. And they had no intention of paying these loans back, but it was a way for the kings to get some money. So the kings were using their strength to try to arrange things for themselves. They also stationed troops where they wanted to. And they accused people sometimes of treason, and they would bring them before something called the Star Chamber. So he would pick the jury, and they would find usually in favor of the king. So Parliament, the average people are getting nervous that their kings are trying to move towards absolutism like the French. That's their fear in England. And they're getting rather nervous, but they don't know how to stop this slide towards absolutism. In the 1630s, Charles goes to war with a variety of countries, Spain and France he has trouble with, and he calls Parliament together and he says, I need you guys to raise taxes for the war effort. And they say, before we do that, we have a list of things we want to propose to you. We don't like these forced loans, and we don't like you putting troops wherever you want to, and we don't like the Star Chamber, and we want to be consulted more often. They put a petition to him saying, we want these things from you, we want more control here of government, and he dismisses them. He says, go home, I'll do this without you. And so he does try to fight it on without them. He gets into a problem, however, with Scotland. The Scottish go up in a rebellion over his leadership up there as he tries to get rid of or undermine the Presbyterian form of government. He has to call Parliament back in the late 1630s. He tries it again. They again put this petition to him, and he dismisses them again and says, I'll go without you. However, what has happened here is this guy, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is a wealthy landowner. He has also seen military service. He's got that petty nobleman background. He's a Puritan. He's one of these followers of the theology of John Calvin. And he is in favor of more democracy. Not for everyone, like the average people, but at least the propertied people being able to have more of a say in government. So he's a Puritan, he's in favor of more representative government, he's fairly wealthy, he's seen military service, and he becomes the leader of the opposition to the king, which is dangerous to do. He and many other like-minded men who think the king is encroaching upon ancient English rights established in the Magna Carta. And so when Parliament refuses again to work with Charles has been sending over people to investigate who are the troublemakers. And they single out Cromwell and about 5 other men who were leading this opposition to the king, and the king tries to arrest them. And he's planning to try them for treason. Cromwell and company get wind of this, and they escape London before they get captured. Once they get outside of London, they say, that king has lost his right to govern. And he is, in fact, the one who's committing treason against English rights. And that leads us to an English civil war. The war is between Cromwell and his faction, which are called the Roundheads, against the king and his supporters, who were called the Cavaliers. Cromwell is an inspirational leader, and he uses a new approach to military, being able to introduce cavalry attacks again in a way that are very effective, and the use of firearms that are effective. And his forces finally defeat Charles I and capture him. And now they're like, what do we do with him? And they do something they'd never done in England. They decide to try him for treason, and then they go ahead and execute him. And they get rid of this monarch because they're saying, we cannot trust this man to govern the way the English people have the right to be governed. Now, unfortunately, we can't come up yet with an alternate to monarchy. How do we create a leadership? How do we have a government? Well, the person who steps in is Cromwell. Yes, I'm happy to.
Did they execute him with an axe?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they used an axe or a sword.
Because the picture has an axe, but he was a king. They didn't use a sword.
I don't know. No, in Germany they usually use a sword, but I don't know.
Is the all noble
Got the sword
sword, because that's
instead of the axeman, right? Yes, it would be. That's a good question. This is an early depiction, early etching of it. I do know that people in the crowd tried to get parts of his blood on handkerchiefs and things like that, because the king had put forward that he was divine, practically. And this is a period of time when Europeans still had lots of superstitions and stuff, and they thought maybe that blood, if it was divine, then it would be useful in curing this disease or that disease, or bring you good luck and things like that. Many people were dumbfounded by the fact that they actually executed a person who'd been suggesting that he was God on earth, and they thought, what is that going to be for us? And that's not correct. And St. Peter and Paul both said God has established all governments, and we are to accept the leadership of our magistrates. What do we do about this? So this was conflicting here. We've got an intersection of religion and politics here. Cromwell becomes Lord Protector of England. That's what he calls himself, Lord Protector of England. He does not introduce Republican form of government. And when I say Republican, I don't mean the Republican Party, but I mean the creation of a republic. A republic is something that has no king. It has elected leaders. He does not form a republic. Republics are pretty rare until the modern age, when the United States becomes the first one to do it in the modern period. I want to look at two ideas here. We've got John Locke is your main one, and Thomas Hobbes. This has to do with the development of political philosophy about what society needs in terms of government. These are two conflicting viewpoints. Thomas Hobbes is a monarchist. He prefers monarchy. He's got the bottom. He does not trust people. He thinks people are bound to mess things up horribly, and that the kings and earls and dukes and knights will always struggle together. They'll always take advantage of, or they'll always go into war, and we need the king to preside over the people. Here's an interesting picture that is associated with his book Leviathan, in which the king is made up of the people, and he is the state, and the state protects the people, and it keeps them from messing everything up. Hobbes says that human nature is such that if you leave them to themselves, they will live short, brutish lives in misery, and chaos will reign. And we need a strong government and strong leadership by one. John Locke, who many of us see as the father of democracy in the modern period, had a more positive look at humans. And he thought humans could make rational decisions, could constrain themselves. As he thinks that all governments are formed by humans at some point in time. He says something that happened called a social contract. Social contract is this idea that we give over individual power to a government, and that government has authority over us. But we do so because a government can protect three things, which are our rights. And those are our right to... You want to try it? What are the three basic human rights that we begin to propose and are presented in our Declaration of Independence? We have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness is how Jefferson changes it later on. But John Locke says, and property. We have the right to our life, our liberty, and our property. The reason governments are formed is to stop the bad people out there who would take your life, would take your liberty, make you slaves of you or serfs of you, or take your property without your consent. Governments are to protect the individuals. And the government only has the right to take these things from you with just cause. That is, if you've broken the law. John Locke says the only reasons governments exist is to protect these things. And he says that James and Charles had broken the social contract because they were taking the life and liberty and property of people without the consent, and they themselves were a threat to society. And if you break the social contract, if you are no longer serving the function that you were originally planned for, the people have the right to overthrow that government and form a new government. By the way, that is what we say in the Declaration of Independence. But we've got to get some theory in this regard beginning to develop. And that's why John Locke's important. He is English. He's living in England, and he is this person who's becoming an advocate for what we now say constrained government, constitutional government, or even democracy. Hobbes believes in authority. He prefers a strong country because people always mess things up. And we have tended to vacillate back and forth between these two things. So frequently we want to come back to authority. Because sometimes it's true. Left to themselves, humans, bad humans especially, emerge and take advantage of the average people. We give you lots of examples. I'll give you the example of Russia. In the 1990s, when they lost the Soviet leadership, lots of thugs emerged in government, and chaos reigned, and they had crime spiked, and they had all kinds of problems. And the people of Russia elected Vladimir Putin, who promised to go after those bad people. And they gave him a lot of authority. Well, now he has all the authority, and he controls all the aspects of the state practically. And so we've moved back to Hobbes. So there's this place where we're trying to get good government and not have an authoritarian form of government, and that's where we're going to be moving. All right, those are some important intellectual developments in the 1600s, which we will come to play upon in the 1700s. We're beginning to develop political ideas about rights. Where are these rights written down? They're only rights because we're saying they're rights, right? I guess the English people are saying we have rights as English people, and this is our tradition, it's our custom. So Thomas Jefferson, when he writes the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he is referencing these ideas that have been growing up over the last century or so, that we have the right to our life, our liberty, but Jefferson changes it, right? Which I'm glad he did change it, because it's very interesting when he changes it to not life, liberty, and property. Pursuit of happiness. Wow, that's quite an idea, right? And we have the right to pursue happiness. It's not even defined what that is. But that makes for the great liberal tradition. When I say liberal today, you might think socially liberal on cultural issues. But what liberty in the classical sense meant in the 1700s into the 1800s was freedom, is liberty. To be liberal is to believe that humans have the right to they want to liberty from government, from an oppressive government that tries to restrain your rights. And in fact, a lot of our Constitution, certainly our Bill of Rights, tries to put restraints on government. So let's go on to the Carolinas. Originally, the colony of Carolina was one colony, and eventually, because of the size of it and the differences that emerged in North Carolina versus South Carolina, southern parts, they split up into two. But in 1663, I believe this is probably under Cromwell, the Carolinas have been formed. And there's a group of Lords Proprietor that they're like the people who have been given the grant of land. Very importantly, John Locke writes the Constitution for the Carolinas. And he comes up with the idea of having all male citizens be able to vote for their county leadership. I'd say probably more than any of the other states as far as allowing more or less direct democracy. They didn't allow women to vote. But I don't think he even had much in the way of property qualifications in Carolina. When they are ready for business, they start giving out pamphlets in London. Come to Carolina. And by 1663, we know what Europeans want. Think about this. You got a choice now, don't you? What colony you want to go to? You want to go to Maryland? You want to go to Pennsylvania? You want to Virginia? Now, probably not Virginia. It's pretty much all the best land's bought up by this point in time. Do you want to go to New Jersey? Come to Carolina, is what this pamphlet says. I want to break down into, what's his name? Carolina? Who's the folk singer? Whose song? Do you know who I'm talking about? James Taylor. I want to break out into Carolina right now. I can't think of his name, so I can't do it. So, come to Carolina and you will enjoy these 6 major privileges. And then I've got a couple of direct quotes from them. They're trying to get industrious and ingenious persons. They're hoping to get a good people to come to them, including any maid or single woman with the desire to go over. Now, these 6 privileges include cheap land, low taxes, liberty of conscience, which you guys know is freedom of religion, popularly elected governments, and overall the opportunity to work for, quote, fortunes far beyond what he could ever hope for in England. And that, by this point in time, is what everybody, is that what we want today still too? Cheap land, low taxes, liberty of conscience, and a popularly elected government, and opportunity to do well economically. It's funny, that becomes the American dream early on. And I can't wonder, but if it's not the competition between the different colonies to make them more attractive to settlers that is pushing these colonies to offer a better and better deal for them. And maybe that's part of the story for why we did become so attractive of a place to come. This is completely different from Europe. Europe is stuck in an aristocracy and in the remnants of a feudal order. And we're creating a society that is very desirous to live in.
Sir, I'm only counting.
I know how many, but I guess there were other ones. I ended up, I've gone away from a direct quotation to summarizing it, and I'm thinking there must have been a little overlap. I don't know what the other privilege was. Interesting, I think this is an interesting primary document. Primary document being something that originates from the period. It's a letter that a young man writes home to his father. He has landed at Charlestown, which we just now call Charleston. He came on a boat called the Samuel. First landed at Barbados, and then came up from Barbados. Barbados, by the way, is an English-owned island in the Caribbean, where a large number of slaves are involved in the sugar production. Most honored father. This is 1682, so this is, about 80 years after Jamestown. The 12th of this instant, which means the May 12th, by providence of God, after a long and tedious passage, we came to an anchor against Charleston at 10 in the night in 3.5 fathom, that's the depth. God be thanked, I had my health very well, except a day or two of seasickness, but most of the other passengers were much troubled with scurvy. You know what scurvy is? Lack of vitamin C, I think, is the main thing, isn't it? I don't know what all the manifestations of it are, but evidently you don't want it. Rot of the teeth, is that it? Your teeth fall out? Pretty quickly? Wow. Yikes. I guess he was happy about that, not getting it. Of the 62 that came out of England, we lost 3. 2 of them were seamen. One died of the scurvy, the other fell overboard. I guess they didn't go back for him. The third was a woman in her childbed. Her child died shortly thereafter. As for the country, I can say but little of it as yet on my own. I guess he's just gotten there. But what I hear from others, the town which 2 years ago had only 3 or 4 houses, hath now about 100 houses. That's a boom town, right? To go from 3 or 4 in a matter of a couple of years to 100. I mean, this is almost like when we think about boom towns out in the West. A lot of people are coming here. Almost all of them are made of wood, although there's excellent brick to be made here, but little of it. All things are very dear or expensive. He gives the prices of different things. He says they're far better than English fare. Looks like he's complaining about the lack of malt beverages. While they in the country are furnished with venison, fish, and fowl by Indians for trifles. So evidently there's a fairly copacetic relationship with Native Americans in the Carolinas. They'll bring in venison, fish, and grouse, etc. in return for hardly anything. And they understand, it talks about butter. They say there is good, very good land, and the further you go up from the coast, the better. But that which at present doth somewhat hinder the settling further up is a war that they are engaged in against a tribe of barbarous Indians, being not above 60 in number, but by reason of their great growth and cruelty in feeding on all their neighbors, they are terrible to all other Indians, of which there are about 40 several kingdoms. The strength and names of them all being known to our governor, who upon any occasion summons their kings or chiefs. We are at peace with all but those who are the common enemies of mankind, those man-eaters before mentioned, they're called the Westos, who have lately killed 2 eminent planters that lived far up in the country, so that they are resolved now, if they can find their settlement, a group of colonials from Charleston, which is difficult to find their settlement because they often change, we're going to go up and try to cut them all off. There's a small party of English out after them, and the most potent kingdom of Indians armed by us, and continually in pursuit of them. And if they can make it, it talks about things. So how would you describe from this letter how the the English in the Carolina are doing with the Native Americans? Sounds like a pretty good relationship. Where are all those Native Americans today? The pattern here is that you cooperate and work with the natives when you first get settled, and then little by little, as the years go by, you encroach upon them and kind of push them out, is the theme of America. But it doesn't sound like we were having trouble with those people. Your next D is Barbados. Here's Barbados, right down. Lots of little islands in the Caribbean. This map over here shows pretty much the agricultural commodities that were being produced in different places. Virginia, these little thing right here is tobacco leaf. Evidently, they were making some money in the exportation of pork. I suppose this is corn back here. This is rice. And rice, you need a very warm temperature and a lot of water and good soil. And what makes Charleston become one of the most important port cities in America during the colonial period is its proximity to Barbados. Rice is exported from Charleston to Barbados to feed the enslaved population of Barbados. It wouldn't make sense to have the enslaved people grow food to feed themselves, because we'd rather them grow sugar to make rum and sugar, to be exported back to either a little bit up to the colonies, but most of it going to Europe. So a close relationship developed between Charleston and Barbados. The land's very good in the low country. Not a lot of labor yet, and a wealthy planter class develops. Barbados is known for extreme cruelty. All the islands, the slave islands, were really cruel. You had a small population of Europeans overseeing a much larger population of enslaved Africans. How does a small group control a large group who's all held in slavery? And the thing is to obviously keep them from being armed, keep them shackled a lot, have overseers who are armed, and then they arrive in Barbados, and as an African slave, you're told, you're going to die here. You're never going to go home. The question is how you're going to die. You're going to die of sunstroke or some other thing, or you're going to die if you resist us, you're going to pay for it. And this is an image of, I don't know who drew it or what, but I do know that Barbados became especially known for cruelty against slaves who resisted them. You do to one person a horrible thing for resisting. Why would you do it to one of them? So the other ones would think, I don't want to have that experience, right? Now, I think we talked about this a little bit last time. How did the English get involved in slavery? It wasn't like they treated humans like this back in England. But those who do become slavers and who live on Barbados and they just get used to the violence and it's how they live, Charleston decides to begin to use slaves too, to produce rice. Because if you've got a slave labor, a wealthy planter can really become wealthy on this slave labor. But they don't know quite how to do it. And so men who understood how to drive slaves and oversee them began to be employed by wealthy aristocrats who arrived in Charleston and basically show them. I don't know if they got them out there with them, but they became like this overseer managerial class that taught slavery. And what I'd like you to know is that Charleston becomes, over time, the main southern colony committed to slavery. Over half the population of South Carolina is enslaved people. That's more than any other colony. And as we move west after the Revolutionary War, as we encroach upon the lands of the Muskogee and the Seminole and the Cherokee, and I can't think of some of the other tribes, this becomes Mississippi, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. This is a rich territory down here where the Cotton Kingdom will grow up, and it's really Charleston capital. Charleston families who go out and get the best of the land. They're the ones who become the planter class, and they bring with them this tradition of using slaves, and they know how to do it. So that southern growth from to the west is really going to be centered out of Charleston. So important senators and defenders of slavery, the most important defenders of slavery in the 19th century, will come out of Charleston. People like John Calhoun and such. So I just need you to know that that's a distinct flavor of that southern part of the United States. Is very different, and it's driven by the money and the connection to Barbados and all of that. All right, the darker side. I think this is it is the last colony that's formed. It's Georgia. 1733, that's quite a ways later, isn't it? And I guess this is under George I, I suppose. Why it's named Georgia? 1733 is what it says here. It's like Charleston was 1670. Between this southern river, it's not the Savannah River, is it? That lies between South Carolina and Georgia. Does anybody know what this river is? At any rate, is it the Savannah River? The territory between the Savannah River and Spanish-controlled Florida, with its northern outpost at St. Augustine, becomes kind of a no man's land, and no one really goes any further south, and it's been left undeveloped. Maybe because they're fearful of getting too close to the Spanish, it's not a good investment, and it's risky because it might be taken. But this is your ID, James Oglethorpe, who's pictured here. He gets the last charter for a colony. And there is one interesting element to what he makes an argument that there should be one more colony, and he says it should be a buffer state. That it would be, now that Charleston's so important and the whole Carolinas might be vulnerable to an attack from Spain, he says, give me a charter of this land and I will establish a presence here. And he had a military background. And he said, I will have an especially martial military. The people who come here will be very oriented towards military, and we will be I will keep up a strong command on the Southern Watch. That's a statue of him on the University of Georgia University, Oglethorpe. And he does one other thing. He wants Georgia to be a place where people who've been condemned to death in England for crimes such as stealing, and after you've stolen so many times they think that you're unreformed, and they had a lot of population growth in England this time. And so young people were going to the gallows. And it was sad because they were desperate. And he says, so there's a little bit of a humanitarian thing in there. He says, I'd be very happy to take a large number of convicted people who are going to have a death sentence and commute that to service. So whenever Georgia plays Tennessee, I try to bring up the fact that there are a bunch of convicts in Georgia. But that didn't last that long as far as that. But there is a sense, I think you may know this about a lot of the southern states, a lot of U.S. Army forts and military bases are in the South. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One reason is because the South is going to be overseeing a large enslaved population. And 4 million enslaved people by 1860. And so this armed oversight of the enslaved population is part of it. And maybe the Georgia martial traditions of James Oglethorpe, but for some reason or another, well, these are probably the factors that contribute to it. The southern states have a more martial culture than a lot of the other northern states did. All right, there's our transplantations. We have the 13 colonies are off and running.